Most vendors will talk about this. Oh, people are key to security. They're the first line of defense. No, they're the last line of defense. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about the IT people. I'm talking about the information security people. These are the people that are key to our program. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how that manifests itself. So again, thinking about the context, being that we have to really efficiently prioritize. One of the things that's come up recently, past couple of years, is what I call vulnerability marketing. And I think again, Andy mentioned this in his talk this morning. In my view, this is it's a blessing and a curse. On the plus side, the fact that we have security people on CNN and other major global news networks talking about some vulnerability du jour is really, I think, a sea change from where we were a long time ago, and it drives a lot of focus at a senior level in companies, because now it's not just trade journals, security journals, or security blogs that are talking about vulnerabilities. It's being talked about in venues that our leadership, our executives, our CEOs, our government leaders are paying attention to. So, but on the downside, it has, in my view, and I see this, I see this in spades, right? Sorry, little brain lock there. In my experience, these marketing efforts artificially change the priority of vulnerabilities, right? And so the problem is, not all of these are created equally. Some of them are important, and some of them are not. But the problem is, it's difficult if you're a CEO of a company watching CNN and some new researcher is talking about a new vulnerability, and of course they're incentivized to make it seem really significant, because let's face it, security globally is a very competitive market. It's growing rapidly. There's a lot of competition now, and both at a corporate perspective and at an individual researcher perspective, people have a lot of incentive to differentiate themselves from their competition. And one of the ways to do that is to get to name a vulnerability. And when you do that, you're skewing the priority. And my observation is, especially having looked at and researched a lot of these public breaches, it's very, very rarely these named vulnerabilities that lead to breaches. It's things that happen every day that are unsexy, that are unnamed, that Microsoft patches on a monthly basis. These are the things that companies are getting compromised by. Not the meltdown inspector. In all fairness, right? We don't know if picking on meltdown inspector may be unfair, right? But let's pick on Heartbleed. That was a terrible, terrible thing, right? As far as I know, there were 2 known incidents related to Heartbleed. That was a really major incident, and there's 2 known incidents. The next lesson I've learned is that least privilege is really not well understood. And that's unfortunate, because least privilege is a very old concept. I mean, I think this goes back to to some of the old documentation that was written back in the 60s and 70s. And my observation is least privilege has kind of morphed into this privilege of convenience, right? What is the most convenient thing? You know, what is the least amount of privileges that still afford some level of business convenience? And the problem is that drives, in my view at least, and I think it bears out in incident data, it drives bad behavior. And rather than trying to find a better way to design a process, we end up taking an easy way out and granting privileges that really shouldn't be there. And a great example I want to point out is NotPetya. So I think most people, if you're here, you're probably familiar with NotPetya, right? So NotPetya was a worm that came out last June, was really devastating, impacted a large number of organizations globally. It was pretty noteworthy because it had code in it that could propagate using the same technique that WannaCry did about a month and a half before. However, NotPetya, even though it had that capability, that really wasn't the way it moved around. The way it moved around was by capturing credentials in the memory of computers that it had infected. And those credentials had administrative access to other systems on the network. And, you know, I can't, in my mind, I can't reconcile why, you know, System A, credentials on System A have to have administrative access to, to systems B through Z. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And not only that, you know, the concept of least privilege goes well beyond just logical access, right? It goes to network access, physical access, right? Why, in the case of NotPetya, you know, why were there capabilities for this to propagate so far and wide? And by the way, if you're not familiar, NotPetya was a worm that was launched in the Ukraine. It's widely reported that it was Russia. I'm not going to get into that debate, right? But you know, the attackers, you know, were apparently targeting Ukrainian companies. It was a piece of tax software that was popular in the Ukraine. However, there were hospitals in the US that were wiped out. There was a hospital in Pennsylvania. There was a hospital in West Virginia. Had no tie at all to anything in the Ukraine. They didn't need to file taxes in the Ukraine, right? So what happened? Problem is least privilege, right? This is a fundamental, at least in my view, a fundamental misunderstanding that our people have. Next is that supply chain is a significant emerging threat. Now, anybody that's been here for a while will say, Jerry, it's been a significant threat for a long time. And that's true, but I think the nature of the threat is evolving. And this has borne itself out in a number of incidents recently. And a couple of examples, again, back to NotPetya. Historically, when we think about supply chain threats, right, we think about the integrity of the systems, the hardware that we buy, or we think about the IT providers who have access to our networks. But the reality is, we have a supply chain threat anytime we provide a space in our environment for some piece of technology to work, especially if it has the ability to auto-update. So in the case of NotPetya, we talked a little bit about that before. In the case of NotPetya, the attacker didn't compromise the networks of, I think 1,000 or so companies. They attacked one network. They attacked the network of this company that makes software named MEDoc. They compromised a server that was used to publish updates to this piece of tax software they relied on the auto update function of this piece of software in all of these companies' networks. That software dutifully downloaded an update, installed itself, and it was off to the races. And the rest is history. In the case of Target, for those of you who don't know, Target's a major retailer in the United States. A couple years ago, they had a really significant breach. A very small, very small heating and cooling service company that actually, their job was to install HVAC systems, cooling systems on new stores. That was their job. That was it, right? They had, because of Target's business processes, they had the ability to log into a billing portal. They had credentials to access Target's network and access this one billing portal. Well, some enterprising attacker phished the login credentials from this very unsophisticated heating and cooling manufacturer, and then used those credentials to launch an attack inside Target's network. They compromised that billing portal, and eventually they got into the system that let them access nearly all of Target's credit card information and much of its information on their frequent shopper. I forget what they call it, right? But huge amounts of data were lost because there wasn't a recognition that these suppliers have, even though they don't have root access on systems, they have access, and it was not well understood what the potential impact would be from the access that was granted. So the next thing I've noticed is that IT software and IT architecture is an art form, right? It's not an engineering discipline, it's art. And there's no objectively right way to do something. And so, from that perspective, it makes many of our jobs really difficult because, it's hard to apply, kind of uniform policies, like ISO or whatever, and expect a consistent outcome because we have such a diversity in how people can implement this stuff. And, by the way, some of this stuff is done intentionally, right? I mean, a lot of companies view the way they implement their IT as a competitive advantage, right? But, the reality is, and this, by the way, it's a very controversial saying in IT security. Hackers only have to be right once, but defenders have to be right all the time. It seems to me like half the community thinks, that's accurate. The other half thinks it's wrong because we as defenders have home field advantage. But the reality is, they're right. It is right. My observation is attackers, even if you catch an attacker, right, they don't stop, right? So yes, it's great. You've detected the attacker. You detected the bad guy. They don't stop. They just try a different way, right? And so that's one of the fundamental problems with designing your own stuff as an art form. We end up kind of constantly chasing the last attack, right? Because an attacker will try something, it'll be effective, we'll fix it. Then then the attackers they still have to feed their kids, right? So they're going to try something new. And we end up in this game of whack-a-mole, where we're constantly trying to fix the latest problem. And let me go back to that for a second. So I wasn't ready to go to the next page yet. So the point on this is we need to get better at designing our systems in a more fundamentally resilient, to use Martin's word, and defendable way, rather than trying to continually tweak and tune and bolt on some blinky box security thing that's going to help us. We need to get better at the fundamentals, right? And that's, by the way, that's kind of the whole philosophy of this entire discussion that I'm having here is, we need to get back to basics. We need to do the basics well. Next observation I have is that attack techniques and tools are getting a lot more complicated. And one of the reasons behind that is there's an incredible amount of investment by nation states and more sophisticated organized crime gangs. But one of the challenges we're seeing, and we've seen this with WannaCry and with NotPetya, which were derived from what was alleged to be some code stolen from the NSA, right? What we're seeing is these techniques and tactics being being reused by people that were never intended to come into contact with it, and so what's happening, at least in my estimation, based on looking at what's going on with these breaches, is that the progression of sophistication of attacks is outpacing the sophistication of our defenses. But again, a lot of this stuff, in my view, is kind of comes back to fundamentals. And we also have to be cognizant that even though we're seeing continual improvement and enhancement in these tools and techniques, the old stuff still works really well. Things like, for those of you who are like me and follow this stuff, there seems to be like a cycle of things coming back around, and we've recently seen macroviruses it come back into vogue. Well, they were gone for 15 years, but they're back, right? And they're back because they work, and so even though we have this kind of pressing threat of super sophisticated APT style attacks, we still have a lot of companies getting compromised from default credentials and misconfigurations and reused passwords. So we have to continually get better, across the board. All right, this one is this is contentious, all right? So the industry endlessly debates, in my view, the effectiveness of end user security training. And I think that's wrong-headed, right? I think we need to get to a point where we're not putting people into a position where the entire future of the company is dependent on whether or not they click a link, a particular link. That's a terrible thing to put your employees into the position of, right? So that's on us. That's on us to design the environment in a way that doesn't require them to very narrowly navigate a set of best practices or being able to detect that that email really wasn't from my boss. It was from some hacker trying to get at our data. But like I said, I think the end user discussion is a red herring, because it's really about us. It's not about them, right? We we need to get better. And part of that, by the way, is making sure that the user community has the appropriate level of training. But again, I come back to, I think we have to be very pragmatic about where we set the bar of what the user community is expected to be able to deflect, right? And I think in a discussion we were having in the back room, Andy said it really well. If we have a situation where a user can ruin or cause great damage to a company by clicking on a link, that's not their problem, right? It's our problem. All right, next thing I've noticed is that business leaders have very little idea of how much IT risk they're accepting. And IT risk is not different than many other types of business risk. There's possibly easier ways to quantify other types of business risk, but they rely on us to identify and characterize that risk and communicate it up. And one thing that's occurred, that is obvious to me, having researched a lot of these breaches, a lot of the business leaders seem to be saying, well, if I'd only known, right? I had no idea that this kind of thing could have resulted from the decision we made. We made a business decision to do something or not do something, and I didn't know that it could result in this terrible type of outcome. But the challenge here is, again, the business is relying on us. And maybe it's not always business, could be government, right? They're relying on us as IT and security practitioners to be able to translate that risk into business terms. And my observation is not only do we not do a great job of communicating that, I think IT people, especially IT people, sometimes security people, maybe not so much, but IT people often lack the creativity to know how adversaries work, right? And so one of the things that I'm becoming a really big proponent of for kind of mainline IT people is to be exposed to adversarial techniques and tactics, so that how this stuff, how attackers are getting in, and you can help you can help design things structurally so they're resilient. The next thing I've noticed is that our IT tools are being used against us, and we're seeing this, I think, in more and more cases. There was a really really significant one called the Dark Soul attacks in I don't remember, it's a couple years back. Really significant attack against a big swath of different types of industries in South Korea. And one of the delivery mechanisms was antivirus, right? And so I think, and if I pull out my crystal ball, right, which is what I'm apt to do, these IT tools are going to become more and more targeted as a opportunity for attackers to get deep leverage into our organizations. And further, my observation is that most IT teams don't view these things as critical assets to protect, right? When we think about stuff that we have to protect, it's our payroll, it's our HR, it's our systems that have our intellectual property. But we don't usually think about our configuration management system, or our Chef server, or our Puppet server, or our Active Directory infrastructure, which, by the way, if those were compromised, has the ability to bypass almost all those other controls on your critical systems. So, lesson here for me is we need to very rationally think about the infrastructure we're designing and implementing, and make sure that we've got the right controls and based on the risk. And that, by the way, to the previous point, requires us to understand what the risk is in the first place. My next observation is, and by the way, I, as a technology nerd, I have a lot of hope for cloud and automation. I think cloud is one of those technologies it has the promise to really revolutionize many things, including security. If you think about the ability, or if you think about things like infrastructure as code, and the opportunities that brings from the perspective of, let's say, resilience or disaster recovery, or the ability to patch systems in a rapid manner, right? There's a lot of possibility. But at the same time, it seems like every time I open my web browser, there's another S3 bucket full of personal data that's been exposed to the world. And so while cloud has a lot of promise, my observation is that our technology people, both IT and security people, don't really understand how to use it. They don't understand how to configure it. They don't understand the risks around it. And in order to fully embrace and take advantage of the benefits of cloud, we've got to get our people in a much better place from a training perspective and knowledge perspective on these technologies. Otherwise, you're going to keep shooting themselves in the foot. My next observation is that indicators of breach are usually obvious, but only after the attack. And we've seen this time and again with Home Depot and Target, right? Where one of the really big controversies of the Target breach was that all of the events associated with the attack were logged. And armchair quarterbacks are asking, well, how could that be? How could they be logged into a SOC who's responsible for monitoring and then taking action? How could they ignore those? How could they not take action? And so another good book recommendation I have for you it's called The Signal in the Noise. It's written by a guy named Nate Silver. And the premise of the book is, and he talks about lots of different types of situations, from the 9/11 attacks in the US to betting on horses and other types of sports type things. His point is that the net of the book is things are obvious after the fact, but they're not obvious before. They're not obvious as they're happening. So my point here is, when we look around and we think about, okay, Target got compromised, all that stuff was being logged, that wouldn't happen to me, right? I look at my logs. My point is, don't fall into that false sense of security, right? Because it's not obvious. I mean, unless you have some magical piece of technology that I'm not aware exists, you have the same problem that everybody else has in terms of being able to separate the signal from the noise. And similarly, the entry point for most of these breaches are really obvious after the fact, right? And I think similarly, we tend to fall into this this mode of thinking, hey, that wouldn't happen to us, right? We have super phishing prevention, right? And the point is, and this kind of goes back to that defenders have to be right every time. The point is, we have to, lost my train of thought there. Sorry. Anyway. Move on to the next page. Punt. All right. Next observation is that organizations are judged on their handling of a breach. All right, and this is something that I've seen become really, really prominent. And it's most notable when a company does a bad job. And a really great example of doing a bad job was Equifax, right? And I'm sorry, Equifax, right? But you did a bad job on the response. You know, almost every company these days, there's more and more reports coming out, 90% or 95% or 99% of companies have experienced a breach. And as time goes on, that's going to continue being the case. But what separates how you're viewed is your response. In the case of Equifax, I don't have any insight into the operations that were going on, right? But in the aftermath, they set up a website to help affected customers that looked like a phishing site, right? They sent out emails that looked like phishing emails, and anyway, it was just not a stellar performance. So the time to think about your breach response is not during a breach. You need to allocate time and effort of your people to prepare for this stuff. My next observation is that organizations are going to have a really hard time meeting breach reporting requirements from some of the new regulations like the GDPR. And in the U.S., the New York State Department of Financial Services has a very similar breach reporting, 72 hours. So you have 72 hours from the time you detect a breach till the time it has to be reported to the regulator. And when I look at the timeline behind many of these breaches that have been reported, there's months. Usually months go by from the time that's been detected until the time has been reported is months. So, we have to get, and I would say GDPR, by the way, I think is a game changer, right? Because in most other cases, it's, the failure to comply with a breach reporting requirement is not very significant. But under things like the GDPR, and I know there's a number of other countries that are considering similar regulations, it's a really significant fine. It's potentially up to 4% of your global annual revenue. So it's a very, very significant fine. In order to be able to meet this, we have to change our organization. We have to have people who are able to handle, to evaluate what happened and identify whether or not there actually was a breach. Because one of the really terrible things, and we've seen this a couple of times. I don't have any names that come to mind right now, but one of the things organizations don't want to do is report a breach and then come back and say, no, we were wrong. And actually, I think Equifax just did this, if memory serves, right? They came back and said, oh, it wasn't really 143. There was actually another 2.5 million. And it's becoming increasingly important to have rapid clarity on what happens, or on what happened, and that requires highly skilled people. So again, the point, hopefully, I drove home is that security is a people problem, right? But it's a problem that starts with us. And my hope is that as we consider our plans and as we think about training and how to allocate resources, that we really put some thought on this, on improving the knowledge and capabilities of our IT and our security staff. So that's it. Thank you for your time.
¿Algunas preguntas acerca de la presentación? ¿Algo que quieren que él aclare algo? ¿No? ¿Allá? Dale, Santiago. No, pues ahí durito o venís acá arriba. So the question is about Equifax.
Okay.
That they, humongous breach and all that stuff, but they were found guilty and then they were given a reward of a huge contract. So how do you go around dealing with the breach or whatever and then saying it's important and at the end it's not really that important?
So it's a great question, and I will say that is something that I think the politicians in the U.S. are wrestling with. I know that there were some politicians just as late as last week questioning why Equifax appeared to be profiting from the breach. I don't have a good good response to that. I would say that there are intangible impacts in addition to in addition to the financial consequences. For instance, reputation and business loss. So, as an organization, I think not only should we try to avoid losing data or breaches and applying proper security for the purpose of avoiding a breach, but we should do it to protect our brand and protect our customers and really do what's morally right. Now, I know that's a happy, fluffy line of BS at the end of the day, but I think until we see normalization of regulations like what we're seeing in with the GDPR in Europe, it's unfortunately there's a person, I forget his name right now, that both Andy and I know. He's kind of an amateur economist, right? One of the projects, little side projects he has is kind of proving that companies really don't suffer financially in the long term from having a data breach, and he tracks kind of like when a company has a breach, you can see their stock price take a little dip, but then they typically go right back. And so it's a good point. But at the end of the day, all we have is our reputation, right? And having a bad reputation as an organization makes many things very difficult for you. And I don't know what more to say about it than that. I don't have a good answer. All right.
¿Otra pregunta? ¿Te la contestó Santiago? ¿Otra preguntita? ¿Nadie? ¿Ya? ¿Dos? ¿Tres? ¿Uno? Ok. Bueno, muchas gracias. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.